Okay, I took the call from my son. He wants me to go down the shop and get the ingredients. We're going to do some cooking tonight. Okay, which I will do in a minute. But essentially, I finished my little story about a number of things, but in particular, 3 places: Manchuria, Abyssinia, and Czechoslovakia. But funnily enough, my little story wasn't about those 3 places at all. It was about the people that invaded those places: Hirohito in Japan, who invaded Manchuria as test number 1 for the League of Nations, to see if the League of Nations would involve itself. It didn't. It sat on its hands. So it wasn't about Manchuria at all. It was about Japan testing out the League of Nations. And then we have Abyssinia. Now, the first one was in 1931, Manchurian incident. And then we have test number 2. Well, that was all about Mussolini. It wasn't about Abyssinia. Abyssinia, it was passive in this little test, What the real test was if Mussolini were to invade Abyssinia, would the League of Nations intervene and do something about that? As it turns out, the answer was no. So it had nothing to do with Abyssinia per se. It was incidental that the test happened to be carried out on Abyssinia, just like it was incidental that Japan's test of the metal of the League of Nations was carried out on Manchuria. It was incidental. Those places are, they're passive. What the real test was the League of Nations going to intervene, like it promised it would, sort of? All right. And the answer was no. It failed again. It didn't intervene. When one joint, Italy, went and tried to go all imperial on another joint. Now, the funny thing is, I think the Abyssinians fought back quite nicely against Mussolini, but the funny thing is, even to the extent that the Abyssinians, I think, won a few battles against Mussolini, and I think in Ethiopia especially, not so much in Somalia, because that's all Abyssinia, not so much in places like Eritrea, or maybe even Djibouti, but in Ethiopia, I think they fought back quite nicely, which is not all down to the bravery of the Ethiopians and all that sort of stuff. I think England had a little bit to do with it as well. They intervened. I think England sometimes comes wandering in and, stuffs up the Italians and all that sort of stuff. So, and then goes out again, It's also to do with terrain as well. Sometimes, you live in a place where the terrain's good for this sort of thing. So you can thank your geography more than your own bravery. But there's always bravery involved too. I've never been a soldier, having to fly into battle against a whole lot of Italians coming in. Heaps of bravery on the part of the Abyssinians, no doubt, in opposing. But the point is, even to the extent the Abyssinians might have won a few battles and all that sort of stuff, that was irrelevant to the test. It wasn't about whether Mussolini was going to get kicked out of Abyssinia or even just out of Ethiopia or anything like that. It was about whether the test was not anything to do with whether the Italians were going to be successful or not, or it was about whether the League of Nations was going to intervene. That was the real test, and the League of Nations didn't. They let Mussolini go for it, and they let Mussolini get beaten here and there, and they let Mussolini win here and there as well. But the point is, they didn't intervene. They sat on their hands, just like they did in Manchuria. Now, test number 3 was was Hitler himself. He would have been watching both those incidents and said, "Gee, as a dictator, the League of Nations, they've threatened dictators like me that if we do anything such as what the Germans were trying to do in World War One, we don't want the Germans empire building. We just want the British doing that, and the French, and everybody else. We don't want the Germans doing that." Britain, had colonised a quarter of the globe, and they didn't want Germany doing that. Anyway, so the villainous Hun and his empire building, and what Blackadder, one of the Blackadder episodes, says the German, Blackadder himself said the German Empire, consists of one sausage factory in Tanganyika. Actually, Namibia is in the news right at the moment because Germany's just apologised for what it did in Namibia as well. So there were some things going on in Namibia as well, thanks to the Germans. But there were things going on here in Tasmania too. Just down south from where I am, we genocided the indigenous people there to a massive extent. There are still indigenous Tasmanians down there, but we essentially just smashed them. It was one of the most complete genocides. It's very hard to actually kill absolutely everybody, but we killed just about everybody. But anyway, so that was, the whole Abyssinia thing was test number 2. But these were tests being carried out not long after World War One, and the world was still in a mess and all that sort of stuff. All right, so there's no comparison to now really, because it's been 70 years since World War Two, and all this is happening in 1931, 35 in the case of Abyssinia, and early 39 in the case of Hitler invading Czechoslovakia, because that was test number 3. See, all these things are, still in a time when there were still bombed buildings everywhere from World War One. We're not in that situation now. We're 70 years out now. We've had massive numbers of major incidents. We had Russia invading Crimea recently, and taking it over, taking it off the Ukraine. We've had heaps of these sorts of things. Everything that's been happening in Kosovo and all that sort of stuff. Rwanda incident. We've had, even just recently, we've had Armenia, Azerbaijan, grabbing a bit of Armenia back, or grabbing it, depending on whose side you're on. This sort of stuff's been happening a lot, but it hasn't been leading to World War III. But these ones back then, Manchuria, Abyssinia, and Hitler invading Czechoslovakia, they were in a context, and I think a very different context than your average imperial kind of gesture these days in 2021. I think the context is different. 70 years since the last World War, and just the whole world is different now. And we still could have World War III, but I don't think you can compare. And I'm no expert, but I doubt that you can compare. You can't say that because Hirohito invaded Manchuria and tested out the League of Nations just after World War One, as ended up one stepping stone towards World War II, and then Mussolini running a test invasion down in Abyssinia, and that becoming stepping stone number 2, and then Hitler invading Czechoslovakia in early 1939 March, I think. That becomes stepping stone number 3 in the direction of World War II. That if for example, something similar happens, it doesn't have to be the same countries or anything like that, but I think I can imagine being an Abyssinian, for example. Well, that might be a Somalian or a Eritrean or a Ethiopian, for example, and someone comes into my area in one of those countries and invades. And I would say, aha! This has happened before. This action is going to lead to World War III, or at least it's likely to, because it happened once before. And you learn the lessons of history, do you not? And history repeats and all that sort of stuff. And it might sound good on Twitter, running that sort of argument. But the whole environment of the world now is very, very different. And you could easily have a situation like that wouldn't lead to World War III, because it really wasn't about Manchuria back then, per se. And it really wasn't about Abyssinia, per se, And it really wasn't about Czechoslovakia, per se, I think. Those three places were passive, and it was incidental that the tests of the metal of the League of Nations in those places, it was incidental. Those places were passive. The action wasn't happening there. Even though the invasion was happening there, the action was, the people who had agency and who were driving those things were back in Japan and back in Italy and back in Germany. That's where the action was, even though the battles happened in those other three places, Manchuria, Abyssinia, and Czechoslovakia. Those places aren't notable. As just because, for example, someone invades Manchuria now, that doesn't, you can't say, oh, that was stepping stone number one, so this is stepping stone number one to World War III. It's not comparable. It's a completely different thing. And it could be China. It could be the other way around. China could invade Okinawa or something like that. Totally flip. Or China can just invade the South Pacific. The South China Sea. Anything can happen. The actual countries don't matter. Just because the first shot of World War II was fired in Manchuria, and the second shot of World War II, arguably, was fired in Abyssinia, and the third shot of World War II was fired in Czechoslovakia, as the great dictators tested out the League of Nations and found the League of Nations wanting, leading to World War II. Well, the reason for all of that back then was to do with those stepping stones, yes, but not to do with the three countries that got invaded as part of the test. And it also involved a hell of a lot of other stuff that doesn't exist now. Other things might lead to World War III now. So if you see that same pattern of things happening now, that doesn't necessarily lead to World War III, because the whole environment is different. These guys were just 10 years out, 12 years out, 13 years out, 16 years out, that sort of zone from World War I. And also, World War I had caused utter devastation to the worldwide economic system, and there was all that nationalist tension going on, because people had been killed. A lot of people had been killed in World War I, and all that stuff was going on, and that stuff isn't present now in the same way. We've got the age of information technology and all that sort of stuff now. The whole environment's changed. Whatever might cause and trigger World War III, I don't think it's a history repeats kind of situation. You can't observe, in my opinion, and my opinion isn't worth anything. That's what's funny about these YouTube clips. But if the same sorts of actions happen now in 2021, well, it's all different now, isn't it? Because we're 70 years out from World War II. And also, there's been major invasions of this sort, the stepping stones type invasions, that have gone on since World War II, and those haven't triggered World War III. We've had stepping stone after stepping stone after stepping stone. We've had North Korea, the Korean War. We've had Vietnam. We've had, oh my God, Iraq. The US going in there. Afghanistan. Arab Springs. We've had all sorts of things. And none of those have led to World War III. So whatever might trigger World War III, well, the canary in the mine for all of that might not be whatever happened in the lead up to World War II, because the world was just too different, in my opinion. And my opinion counts for nothing. End of episode.